We are living in a historic moment where the North Atlantic Treaty Organization faces its greatest identity crisis since its creation in 1949. What began as a supposed defensive alliance to contain Soviet advancement in Europe has transformed into something completely different, raising fundamental questions about its purpose and legitimacy in the 21st century. The situation reached a critical point when Mark Rutte, NATO's Secretary General, made unprecedented statements directly threatening Brazil, China, and India, with sanctions if these countries did not pressure Vladimir Putin to negotiate peace with Ukraine. This declaration represents a radical break with the organization's 7-decade posture, revealing a paradigm shift that goes far beyond traditional defensive issues. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, it is essential to analyze what truly motivated these threats. NATO, a military alliance created specifically for the defense of the North Atlantic, now arrogates to itself the right to arbitrate global, commercial, and diplomatic matters, interfering in relations between countries that are not part of its jurisdiction. Even more disturbing is the fact that this supposedly defensive organization is threatening sanctions against nations that maintain legitimate trade relations with Russia, while its own members, including Turkey and several European countries, continue to trade with Moscow without suffering any internal reprisals. The pressure exerted by the United States to raise member countries' military investment to 5% of GDP reveals another worrying facet of this transformation. For decades, most NATO countries struggled to meet the 2% of GDP target for military spending. Now, abruptly, more than double that investment is demanded. Economically unsustainable demand for many European nations still recovering from recent economic crises, Spain has become the most evident example of this resistance, with Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez publicly declaring that his country cannot commit 5% of its GDP to military spending, limiting it to 2.1%. This realistic position earned the country direct threats from Donald Trump, demonstrating how economic coercion has become a central tool in the alliance's dynamics. The fundamental question that emerges is where the resources to finance this massive militarization will come from. Inevitably, these investments will be funded through cuts in education, social programs, and basic infrastructure investments, generating a significant social cost for populations that may not understand or support this military escalation. The situation becomes even more complex when we analyze the recent accessions of Sweden and Finland to NATO. These countries maintain strategic neutrality throughout the Cold War, benefiting from a balanced diplomatic position that allowed them to maintain constructive relations with both the West and Russia. The decision to abandon decades of successful neutrality at a moment of maximum tension represents a questionable strategic rupture that has turned them into potential targets of future conflicts. Finland, with its extensive border with Russia, now serves as a NATO outpost for monitoring major Russian naval bases in the Arctic, including the strategic ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. This geographical proximity places the country in an extremely vulnerable position in the event of a military escalation, effectively turning it into the front line of a potential conflict that did not exist when it maintained its neutrality. NATO's official discourse continues to emphasize the Russian expansionist threat, but an objective historical analysis reveals a different pattern. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has continuously expanded towards Russian borders, incorporating Eastern European countries and now traditionally neutral nations. On the other hand, Russian military actions have been consistently reactive, responding to provocations or defending Russian-speaking populations in disputed territories. Russia has not invaded distant countries like Iraq or Afghanistan, nor has it promoted regime changes on distant continents, limiting its military actions to its immediate sphere of influence. The rise of the BRICS, as an alternative economic bloc, represents the true catalyst for this radical change in NATO's posture. The group, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as well as new members like Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, represents approximately 40% of the world's population and a growing share of the global GDP. Even more significant is the development of alternative payment systems to the Western financial system, directly threatening the hegemony of the US dollar in international trade. Mark Rutte's threats to Brazil, China, and India must be understood in this context of expanded geopolitical competition. It is not a genuine concern for peace in Ukraine, but an attempt to dismantle the BRICS bloc through economic intimidation. The strategy seeks to create internal divisions within the group, exploiting the different economic capacities and vulnerabilities of each member. While China has the resources and alternatives to withstand Western sanctions, countries like Brazil find themselves in a more vulnerable position. Due to their dependence on Western-controlled markets and technologies, this strategy reveals a fundamental contradiction in the Western position. Same countries that ardently defend free trade and globalization when it suits them now threaten sanctions against nations that legitimately exercise their commercial sovereignty. Brazil, for example, maintains trade relations with Russia in sectors such as agriculture and energy, transactions that are perfectly legal under international law and have nothing to do with military or security issues. The influence of Donald Trump on the transformation of NATO cannot be underestimated. His transactional approach to international policy, combined with domestic American pressure for allies to pay their fair share, has contributed to the accelerated militarization of the alliance. The American president made it clear that he considers NATO primarily a mechanism for selling American armaments, even stating that he would send weapons to Ukraine as long as the Europeans paid for them. This commercial approach to international security explains much about the pressure to increase military spending. The American defense industry, one of the most profitable sectors of the economy, needs stable markets for its products. A militarized Europe represents billions of dollars in arms contracts, from missile systems to combat aircraft. NATO has effectively become a marketing mechanism for the American military industry, disguised as a defensive alliance. The impact on Eastern European countries deserves special attention. Nations like the Baltic states and Hungary, which joined NATO after the end of the Cold War, find themselves in a particularly delicate position. Many of these countries depend almost entirely on the collective defense of the alliance, lacking significant independent military capability. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, for example, rely on other NATO members even for the policing of their airspace. The pressure to drastically increase military spending places these countries in an unsustainable situation. Their less complex economies simply cannot sustain military investments of 5% of GDP without severely compromising the social well-being of their populations. This situation creates a paradox where the pursuit of security through militarization can generate internal social instability. The Ukrainian issue serves as both a catalyst and justification for many of these changes, but it also reveals the limitations of NATO's strategy. After 3 years of conflict with hundreds of billions of dollars invested in armaments and military support, the situation on the ground remains essentially unchanged. Russia maintains control over significant territories in eastern Ukraine. Its economy has adapted to Western sanctions, and Putin remains firmly in power with considerable domestic popular support. This reality suggests that the strategy of direct confrontation may not be producing the desired results. Or worse still, the continuous escalation increases the risks of a broader conflict that could directly involve NATO members, especially those with borders close to Russia. Poland, in particular, is in an extremely vulnerable position, bordering Belarus, the Kaliningrad region. And being in close proximity to Ukraine, the rise of far-right and Eurosceptic parties in several member countries adds another layer of complexity to the situation. These movements, though diverse in their specific motivations, share skepticism towards supranational organizations and a preference for national sovereignty. In Hungary, Viktor Orbán has systematically challenged NATO and European Union positions, maintaining relatively cordial relations with Russia and resisting some sanctions. In France, the influence of Marine Le Pen and the National Rally is consistently growing, with proposals that include reviewing French participation in NATO's integrated structure. In Germany, the Alternative for Germany has questioned the need for confrontation with Russia, arguing that German economic interests are better served through energy cooperation with Moscow. Even in Italy, parties like the Northern League have expressed sympathy for Russian positions on various international issues. These developments suggest that NATO's internal cohesion faces growing pressures. The organization was created assuming a basic consensus among Western liberal democracies on shared threats and priorities. When this consensual basis is questioned by significant political movements within the member countries themselves, the legitimacy and effectiveness of the alliance are inevitably compromised. The economic dimension of this crisis deserves detailed analysis. The world is witnessing a fundamental geopolitical transition, with the global economic center of gravity moving from the North Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. China has become the largest trading partner for over 120 countries, including many NATO members. European dependence on Russian energy, although reduced after 2022, revealed the complex interdependencies that characterize the modern global economy. The attempt to force binary choices between economic blocs, the West versus the BRICS, ignores these fundamental economic realities. Countries like Germany, whose economy critically depends on exports to Asian markets, find themselves in an impossible position when forced to choose between geopolitical alignment and economic needs. The German automotive industry, for example, depends heavily on the Chinese market for both sales and component supply. This tension between geopolitical imperatives and economic realities is forcing a fundamental reassessment of the global security architecture. NATO, conceived for a bipolar Cold War world, struggles to find relevance in a multipolar international system where economic, military, and soft power are distributed among multiple actors. The nuclear issue adds particular urgency to these considerations. The increasingly aggressive rhetoric from both sides, combined with the continuous modernization of nuclear arsenals, creates existential risks that transcend any specific geopolitical dispute. Russian nuclear doctrine has been updated to lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons in response to existential threats to the Russian state. Simultaneously, NATO has expanded military exercises near Russian borders and discussed the positioning of missile defense systems that Moscow considers threats to its deterrent capability. This dynamic creates a classic security paradox, where measures taken by one side to increase its security are perceived by the other as threats, generating countermeasures that reduce the security of all. History is replete with examples where this logic led to conflicts that neither side truly desired, but which became inevitable due to the dynamics of escalation. The situation in the Indo-Pacific adds another dimension to this complexity. The growing tension between the United States and China over Taiwan, the South China Sea, and trade issues creates the possibility that NATO members could be drawn into regional conflicts that do not directly affect their core security interests. The United Kingdom and France have sent warships for patrols in the Indo-Pacific, actions that Beijing considers provocative and unnecessary. This geographical expansion of NATO's operations beyond its traditional area of responsibility reflects the globalization of security interests. But it also dilutes the organization's focus and increases potential points of friction. When a regional defensive alliance becomes a global actor, it inevitably generates resistance from other powers that see these actions as threats to regional stability. The future of NATO fundamentally depends on its ability to adapt to these new geopolitical realities without losing its internal cohesion or provoking unnecessary conflicts. This requires abandoning fantasies of a return to a unipolar world dominated by the West and accepting that we live in a truly multipolar system where cooperation and competition coexist in a complex manner. A reformed NATO could focus on its core competencies: collective defense of member territories, intelligence cooperation, in response to genuine security threats, while abandoning ambitions of global hegemony. This would mean accepting that other regional blocs, including BRICS, have a legitimate right to exist and pursue their economic interests without military interference. Alternatively, persistence on the current trajectory of confrontation and expansion could lead to the fragmentation of the alliance, as different members conclude that the costs exceed the benefits. Brexit has already demonstrated that even long-standing partnerships can be reversed if populations think, or be convinced, that political elites are pursuing agendas that do not serve national interests. The true measure of NATO's success should not be its ability to intimidate or contain rivals, but its contribution to a stable international system, where conflicts are resolved through diplomacy rather than military force. Paradoxically, less aggressive and more genuinely defense-focused NATO could be more effective in preserving the peace and stability it theoretically seeks to protect. The current moment represents a historic crossroads. The choices made by NATO leaders in the coming years will determine whether the organization evolves to become a constructive force for global stability or becomes an obsolete remnant of a geopolitical era that is already past. The answer to this question will have profound implications not only for Europe and North America, but for the entire international system in the 21st century. And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel to keep thinking the world how it really is.